I'm Yousuf Kahn. I'm currently working for a stealth startup. Prior to that, I was CIO for a little company called Pure Storage. You may have heard of it. I joined the company at a few hundred employees and left 3.5 years later. And having grown the company and seen the company's growth and post-IPO. Prior to that, I was CIO for a cybersecurity company called Qualys, very character-building experience. I've always been the very first CIO of a company. Probably the best way to explain that, I'm probably the most begrudging hire that the executive team sort of brings into place. They sort of say, data issues, infrastructure, go-to-market, weird guy in a sweater vest, how much damage can he really do? Maybe we should hire him. And so I get bought in. I've been very deeply entrenched in the building out sales ops partnerships. In one role, I actually owned and ran sales ops. It just about survived, so that's good. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk, and I'm really impressed with all the stuff that you and the team have been doing at Fullcast.
Bala and I was still at Salesforce, and we were talking to customers and prospects. I said, we're thinking of building this platform for sales planning. Would you be interested? And everybody said yes. And we left our job.
Right.
And all those people who said yes, they told us when we got to them, oh yeah, that planning issue, we fixed it. This data sucks. And they're like, oh, we just left a job.
Right.
And this data has been coming up again and again. And so two questions, like when I looked at their background, was A, being as a CIO on the other side, right? We have always had this issue that who owns data?
Right.
Right. There was a question in the morning as well. Right? Who owns data? We used to go back and forth. Oh, well, it's an IT issue. And IT would say, no, it's a business issue. So in your world, who owns data?
So my viewpoint is that everybody owns data being correct. But my guidance is that there should always be, you've got to probably figure out, not about organizational structure of data, but accountability. And I think those are the things that tend to basically get missed. I mean, I looked at this, I was super excited when you had kind of invited me to be here, and we talked about data governance. I sort of felt like, when I walked in, I sort of felt, okay, this is going to be this kind of, hey, we found a CIO, let's going to basically, a little bit target practice, totally fine. A little bit of sales ops, data governance, group therapy. I kind of get that sense that's basically going on. That seems to be a very constant theme. Yeah. So I think one thing to think about it from that standpoint is there's an ownership aspect, and I think the only way to be able to drive ownership is to be able to agree what the outcome you're trying to aim for. So I thought having a policy-based approach, which is the earlier session, I thought that was really, really telling. Right? I think that's actually important because then it's very clear, you're being very prescriptive about what you're aiming for. Now, the friction that goes with that, you have to actually get away from the emotive aspects to it. And I find it really very insightful that it's actually an emotive topic.
It is.
I've never come across this before. I'm just like, wow, you really care about this. Yeah. And funny enough, I really care about it as well. Yeah. And so that's why I got deeply entrenched. But I think it demonstrates that people have strong opinions about where a company is heading and what the strategy is to be able to do that. Yeah. And that's why it's so vital to do it. So in my viewpoint, I've done this about 2-3 different times where I've built up data management team, data cleansing functions, data governance motions. And so I think it's as much about ownership, which is really about creating shared ownership and shared values, as much as it is about accountability and the process for that accountability.
So we talked about this earlier this morning as well. A lot of times, right, I mean, actually in most scenarios, sales ops started off as a shadow IT.
Yes.
Right? I'm not getting support from my IT team, so I'm just going to hire a guy, put him in touch with a CRM, and just let him run with it. And eventually that role becomes big, and we go back and forth between sales and IT. And sales says, I'm not getting support from IT, and IT says, I'm going to give you some guys who will do some Salesforce customization. So how do you build a partnership in that case?
Right. So actually, let's do this. How many of you have built a partnership with your IT organization? Okay, just remember, whatever happens in sales ops only gets announced at SKO, so that's okay, don't worry. So we're amongst friends here. So let's ask the question again. How many of you have actually built up good partnerships with IT? Okay. How many of those are directly involved with you on working on data issues? Very few. Okay. So, I think that there's a critical piece to this is one of the things that a lot of people in the IT organization don't tend to connect and align with is being able to get people enabled and giving them context about what you're trying to achieve. This is the biggest failure of sales ops functions and IT functions not being able to work together. Because what happens is you come into either a company sales kickoff or a QBR, you've come up with objectives, you've figured out what revenue targets are, you've come up with comp plans and all the other stuff around it. And you haven't really articulated that. And by you, I mean we collectively haven't had a conversation about what we're actually trying to achieve, right? And when you don't have that conversation, then then it comes down to systematic tooling issues.
Yeah, then you go to the CRM admin.
Exactly.
Yeah,
then it's like that, and that's exactly why. Because in the same instance, what you've got to be able to do is like changing priorities from IT perspective. It's a real task. And so one is I'll give you 3 pieces of advice. Number 1 is signal early. Like you should be talking about blocking people's calendars. I'm giving you deep tactics here, like literally blocking people's calendars and bringing people in from the IT organization. If you don't have someone in IT, then you need to be able to fight that fight because IT people love having additional resources. And so if they've got friends outside of IT saying, we should give them more resources to work with us, that's a really, really good thing. That's one. Number 2 is figure out what the first visible win looks like. This is one of the key failures that most people seem to get. They're like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to have this entire data cleansing process, and we're going to have all of these committees. Forget that, right? Figure out what your first 0 to 1, like figure that piece out, and then everything else goes along the line. I think the third thing is there is a big focus on enablement. There's a very big disconnect about where the value chain and value proposition is in terms of what sales ops does and IT does. Actually, very, very close correlation. That's why I'm deeply passionate about it. And so if anyone actually, I'll volunteer it now. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards. But if you think it makes sense to be able to have a conversation with, not necessarily with your CIO, but IT organization, if you want to facilitate that, I'm more than happy to basically volunteer that right off the bat. That's easy for me. And because I think it's important. And I think it's important because companies are now competing at a level that they haven't been doing so before, number 1. So do you really want to spend time trying to figure out the right data set and keeping it clean, or do you want to go out and sell? I know very easily what the answer to that question is, right? So if you come down to the objective of understanding that you're creating, and you're part of creating friction in the business, and you're able to articulate that back to IT and be able to make sure that sales ops and IT are aligned, I think that's a critical piece. Most people have not had that enablement. They haven't understood. It's like the worst case is basically doing some sort of like IT maintenance at the end of the quarter on like a critical system, right? This is like the worst nightmare. This is when these are the clear signs. You're like, huh? I'm like, I was speaking to CR, I'm like, really? You thought that was absolutely okay to do? What?
Why?
Like I mean, I know like it's like what were you thinking basically, right? But it shows that there hasn't been alignment about where to be able to do that. So for example, if you look at finance functions, you would not dream of doing something at quarter close. After the quarter is closed, when they're closing books, why would you try and do a big change in finance? It just wouldn't happen, right? So the same thing needs to apply.
So there's a little bit of an accountability in the sales side of the house to build that trust.
Yeah, totally.
Find the quick wins.
Yeah.
And I think Seeley said in the morning as well, right? Data cleansing projects. Don't take this building a cathedral approach, but look for small wins and get them out of the way. I've had a lot of CIOs who won't touch this. They're like, why would we? That's why, like when we first spoke, I was like, wow, you care about this, and clearly there's a way for both planning execution, which is great, and there's a way to be able to make sure that you have an operating. So I think the true output of a partnership between sales ops and IT is being able to build out an operating platform for the go-to-market organization. I think if you have that as a vision to be able to aim toward and say, what does this operating platform look like? From data to planning to execution and monitoring that is a good shared goal to operate towards. Excellent. So one of the things you talked about is AI.
Yes.
Right? So we hear a lot of, in fact, that was one of the questions that even when we were last year going through some fundraising discussions, like some of the VCs would say, what is your AI story? And we were like, AI is great, but the data sucks.
Wow, okay.
Right? You have all these tools that sales ops is being pushed down to say, do AI.
Yep.
Right? How do you, as a CIO, what's your perspective?
So I think the biggest thing about AI, and there's actually different subsets of it. So, I mean, so I would make 2 recommendations. Recommendation number 1 is look at the documentary, which is Bobby Fischer Against the World. It's on Netflix, and so plug in for the Bobby Fischer analogy. And the second is, actually, if you look at a couple of videos about AI and the subsets of AI, then you'll figure out which ones are actually appropriate for specific functions. So I think the biggest misnomer about AI and how you filter against which companies actually know AI very well and which don't are which are the ones which are solving a business problem. This is the biggest issue that I typically have. There's a lot of companies who are like, they're like, oh, the AI possibility is here. There's a lot of hype around it. But the question comes down to a very basic one. Are you solving a business problem? And if you're not able to really clearly explain what that is and how you're applying AI methods to it, then it's not what it is, basically. The second aspect is really being able to demonstrate that value relatively quickly. Because that's part of it, right? You're like, hey, I'm using machine learning. I'm using all this compute power. I've got all these algorithms in place. I can sort of make this happen. But there's a critical piece to this, which is about the preparation of data and the cleansing of data. How you attack that, that's a very, very long issue. There probably should be an entire summit based on that alone, basically. So I think it's a much bigger issue, but I think you can actually you can be very incremental about it. That's what I basically be. And I think the large part of that, from an AI standpoint, is when you look at machine learning algorithms, a large part of this is about how you're able to basically build out the learning piece of the machine.
Yes.
Like how it is to basically be able to do self-correction, right? And that's based on large sets of data that it reads against.
So if somebody, like one of the things we run into all our prospects that we talk to, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just us. It's like, I know Insight Squared, Clary, all the reporting tools.
Sure.
They run into this issue is like, we have bad data. We got a great tool, but the data sucks. So if as an organization we want to build a data governance structure, how would we go about it? What can we expect from IT? What would you expect from sales ops as an IT person as well?
Okay, so let me ask one question. If someone came up to you and say, would you love to be part of a data governance team, how many of you would be excited about that? And
Exactly.
These are my people. My people right here. Sweater vest, Bobby Fischer. We got each other. We're getting each other absolutely fine. So just like policy isn't exactly the most exciting word in the English language, neither is governance. Okay? So I think forming that team requires a couple of key things. Most people don't like it when they're not part of the process. So actually, the best way to start, in my viewpoint, is to actually canvas much wider in the organization, and then people check in, and then eventually they realize that they're checked out. And that's actually a good thing. Because what you find in that process is you find people who are checked in, who have an opinion, and who actually want to get it done, versus those people who are like, okay, I can be somebody else is solving this problem, I'm at the receiving end to it. So I have this mantra, which when I've been able to, every time I became a CIO or joined a company, I went through like this kind of period of like taking all the lessons I learned in my last job and make sure that I don't repeat them. And so a large part of that is you basically are able to figure out one of the things I learned was that actually if silence equals acceptance. So you're able to, most people get into this motion, they're like, and they hate surprises, right? People just hate surprises, especially in the corporate. They're like, I've got these projects, now you're coming in, you ask me something. So I would rather you just start big, right, and bring everyone around the table, and then you bring something down, number one. Number two, please, please, please don't talk in the abstract. This is the worst thing. There's a whole bunch of people. I've been in conversations with multiple CIOs and people in sales ops, and I don't know, maybe it's because I don't drink and like I like wear a sweater vest. Like, people just tell me stuff. It's like weird. I'm like, wow. I'm Yousuf, by the way, after 45 minutes, but okay, sure, go ahead, right? And so you find that a lot of people have this issue where they speak about, they literally you've had these conversations, and I remember speaking to someone in sales ops once at a couple of companies, and we were talking. It was a group therapy dinner. I remember this. Some of the people in the room were actually at that dinner, but I won't basically point them out. And we were having this dinner, and they said, we came into this. We had this entire 2-week conversation, and it really just turned out that this person just didn't know how to use Salesforce. Like they were coming up with the reports about saying you're not doing this, you're not doing this. You're like, how did you pull this report off? Like, what were you thinking? Like that doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, okay, shame that we didn't disable that or whatever it is, but like, you didn't have that. So one thing is get concrete examples, right? This notion of like, oh, if we did this and this, how it basically work. And the fact that when you come back, like, okay, give me 7 customers that you would basically give me 7 customer records and 8 transactions that would relate to. Yeah, no answer. They're like, oh, it sounds great. It sounds great. We're in a real business here. Yeah. We're going after a particular market. We're going after a particular customer. So once you start changing these things, right, demonstrate. It's kind of the Weight Watchers example, before and after.
Yeah. So you got to pick use case by use case.
And I'm sorry, I just have to agree. Maybe I'm just not that smart, and I just have to learn through just like taking in lots of data. But you have to be prescriptive.
Yeah, agreed.
It's education through repetition. So that's my viewpoint.
Agreed. So having been a CIO, supporting sales ops teams for large companies, right? What have been some of the things that you would say are key wins that, from your perspective as a CIO, that you felt, right? We as an IT team, this is what we gave to the ops teams.
Mm-hmm. So one thing was that I decided to deal with problems early before they become a problem. This was my biggest lesson that I came in. As a first-time CIO into many companies, I'd seen a lot of these problems. And let me tell you something. Dealing with problems much later on, wow, that requires entire like change management strategy and like entire conversations, and then you have like a whole bunch of people who are like not adapt to change. They're like, I was here from the very beginning, and now my role is changing, and then you're like, no, it's really good effort, it's not an insult on you. Like all of these things happen. So I would say deal with the problems early. So one of the things was that I looked at in a couple of companies and spoke to a number of CIOs where structuring data across specific territories and specific segments was something that needed to basically be cleansed. Right now, data cleansing is a really, really hard. It's a hard thing. So the one thing to assume is you're never going to get it perfect. So I'll give you an example. So people know Dun & Bradstreet, great source of information and guidance. Like you'll have hundreds and hundreds of different of data sources. So just pick one, know that it's not perfect. And then you need to go through a journey of basically saying, okay, it's incremental. A large part of the data cleansing, most people assume that this data cleansing process and governance team has a fixed reference point. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Companies merge and they get acquired, and then they change names, and then they change domicile, and then they change territories. And all of this stuff basically happens. So it's a basically running motion. I think the thing that didn't work without having any systems was we worked upfront to figure out what a playbook looked like. So we went through a bunch of scenarios. We said, which are the worst examples that exist of data which is terrible, and what would this look like in a better world? And you discover that we're like, wow, there aren't 17 different companies of the same name in the same territory. Magic, that sounds great. Wow, that would be great if we just had one, right? I remember shouting at this one company and people speaking at an event, and I said, here's a shocker. Fortune 500 is 500 companies. Can you believe that? Shocker, huh? Forbes Global 2000, just guess how many companies? 2,000. Isn't that a shocker? Now, I totally get that there's a whole bunch of subsidiaries that go into that. And then there's a whole bunch of, you've got a whole bunch of DUNS numbers that exist in different parts of the world. I get that. But start with the basics, right? Yeah. If you can't get 500 to be 500, there's an entire magazine that comes out.
Exactly.
Right? They're literally the reference point is literally there. Yeah. You get it up from the newsstand for $3.25, and you're like, all right, let's go to Salesforce, and let's look at 500 companies. And then you basically say, what ranking is this? And you're like, that's rank number 20. And then someone comes up to you and says, that's rank number 35. I'm like, okay, look, check this. Centerfold. This is like the nerdiest centerfold ever. Like, hey, look at this. Look at this company. This paint manufacturer in the middle of the United States is rank number 212. Look at that.
Exactly.
I feel so good about that.
That is such a important point. Like Bala and I have been having this discussion, so many customers, and they're like, what data source should we use? And I'm like, pick your poison. Pick one.
Pick one.
Stick with it. Maybe establish some standards and governance.
Look, right? I think Dun & Bradstreet is a very, very good center foundation point. Yeah. I think building out APIs into that is a very, very good solution set. I think I think Salesforce have done a very, very good job, and they'll continue to basically build on that. But if you focus on segments and outputs and understanding those data, so like there is going to be information from these data sources which is incomplete.
Yes.
They don't have information.
They don't have
it. As you go around the globe, it starts to basically dissipate. That's totally fine.
And it's always
That's where you're
out
able
of
to
date.
get it. Totally.
And it's always out of date, and so you just got to create some policies.
Totally.
and stick with them.
Totally.
So.
Is this helping or am I venting?
No,
I'm
no,
not venting, right?
no, totally.
Okay, I just want to double check.
This is.
All right, double check.
No, this is perfect. I mean, this is.
I'm really trying to be helpful. I got
this is in line with how
full
we
cast,
think.
full vent, basically. All right, good. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So, what do you think about locking down the accounts by territory, even if it's not enriched by D&B? Do you feel like organizations should have the ability to enrich data points throughout the year?
So I am a supporter of locking down accounts. I think that's actually I think that's a good policy and good practice. But you've got to then be prepared for major infractions, right? So if you haven't enriched it and if you haven't basically put it into place, then there has to be a degree of reasonableness around that, right? So so I think getting to a place where there is a corrective measure, that's the important piece. There's a big difference between sort of lockdown within reason and without reason. That's my viewpoint on it from a system standpoint. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, this is an open discussion, just not Yousuf and me, but it's an open discussion, everything around data.
Yeah.
So one of the things as a CIO who supported large organizations, we had a session this morning around the future trends of sales operations and all of those things, right?
Yeah.
So as a CIO, what do you see as a trend in sales ops? And if you coming in from a lens of having established governance actually in large organizations, what would be the order of priority that you'll say? Okay, you have a lot of aspiration in sales ops.
Yeah.
But to make it real, focus on these 2 or 3 things.
So I think territory planning by default is one of the areas which requires probably more tweaking than more radical changing. And by that I basically mean that I think I would basically pick areas which are more mature and that have improved over time as a way to, and I see, so I think each organization will, so one piece of advice is figure out places where you think you've got a degree of maturity and that you're confident about and build on that to be able to improve. That's one. I think a second piece from a sales ops perspective is actually look at the different tool sets you have and actually have an honest conversation about which ones are truly adding value.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch, there's a whole bunch.
Tool stack, right?
Yeah. The tool stack review, like seriously, get a technical writer and like pretend they're a new hire in the sales ops and pretend they're a sales ops intern and say, tell me what systems you basically have, right? Or go to your finance business partner and say, what are all the subscriptions we've been basically paying for? Because you'll be like, oh wow, it's like a whole bunch of stuff. Like I'm like, what is this thing? I was like, oh, that person got hired in 2003. They bought it, and there's an auto renewal, and next thing you know.
So how do you see the tool stack actually contributing to the data issue?
So I believe so. The more I think you've got to have tools with purpose. Number one. Number two, you've got to basically figure out which of those are really affecting the data and what function that they're basically affecting. So, for example, there's an aspect of putting together data governance and data cleansing process and a tool stack around that, right? It's a combination of APIs, it's a combination of rules, there's a combination of people and process as well as the technology. Then there's another portion which is a much harder conversation, which is like, okay, which tools are really impacting and enhancing my go-to-market motion, right? Then there's a question about taking a little bit of a step back and say which tools have really helped me or caused friction or been a blocker for me to do effective territory planning, right? And I think having a conversation about that and being honest about it is probably the right way to do it. Let me tell you, the defining filter to a lot of this part is integrations and APIs. If you have tools which are, and by the way, the best things are the greatest vendors are the ones who are like, oh yeah, we're thinking about, or we're like, it's on the roadmap or whatever it is, basically, right? So and I value that. I'm not in any way dismissing it. What I'm saying is that if you're a company which is operating in this space, be very clear about the connection points that you're basically making into your existing sales stack. Because if you think about this space, like I don't think having sales ops functions with lots and lots of tools is a good thing. what I think about them is like going to the tool which is going to serve a purpose, and then being able to use that to be able to drive value. Yeah. Right? That's the key thing.
So we talked about territory management.
Yes.
We talked about data. And one of the things that came across is, we were talking about Ops Hill this morning.
Yeah.
And so you and I were chatting about this. 2019.
Yes.
We're still talking about Excel, planning in Excel.
I declared war on Excel hell. I called it Excel hell, basically.
Okay.
I made so many, I wouldn't say enemies, but I would say I had many robust discussion with people about Excel. It was a very character-building conversation, very, very, and it was just like, wow, like, what were you thinking having this conversation? I was like, I don't know. It took you 3 weeks to fix this cell because you didn't know what this was relating to. I don't think that's a good thing to do, right?
Yeah, so like as a CIO, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen companies still doing planning in Excel.
Yeah.
Right? What's the cost of doing that and doing that in Excel?
I think, I mean, I've put in processes and tried to improve over time. I've learned from a whole bunch of people. So Ruchika Chopra is someone I look to very closely. She used to run sales ops at Nimble Storage, and she's at Mist Systems now. And so, people like that who've kind of gone through and understood how to be able to really, so one is peers. So I think having forums like this is absolutely critical. I think the other piece is, and so that's why you learn, unless you can make a big change from Excel, like how do you optimize existing processes?
Yeah.
That's one. The second piece is the impact of Excel and this back and forth. I mean, it's really difficult to paint this picture, but think of it this way. Like entire weekends are they're underreported.
Yes.
Let's just put it this way. There's just a lot of weekends have been spent on Excel macros. And I don't know, maybe there's some people who get joy out of it. I don't, personally speaking. Like I don't. Like I know, like sweater vest, like okay, librarian, macro, like this the guy who probably likes his coding. But it's not a great thing. Like that's like doing that on your LinkedIn to say I'm really good at that. Like that's probably not a good thing in 2019. So what I would say is lighten the load on the Excel spreadsheet for a little bit. Look at tools which you're going to be able to have much more direct collaboration. Yeah. The best Excel sheets are the ones where you are literally in the room building it together as one individual and just going away basically. But once you start doing this email back and forth, the classic days of IT where you had Exchange servers, like we just saw these like email, like .xls coming through every single time. We're like, holy, we're going to get more storage. Like someone called a storage guy, like there's like Excel going in because, and the version control was after 1.9.1.2. I was like, that's great.
Yeah.
Like, someone actually thought that through.
That's exactly how
someone
we
thought
roll.
that through. That's fantastic.
We had the same issue.
So I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, I can imagine.
That's my inside voice.
Clearly, that was just like, I think it's, we've had this thing that, how many startups have been created for killing Excel, and it's still around. But,
okay, I don't have any problem with that. I don't think it is a constructive platform to be used for such a critical motion.
Exactly.
And I think collectively we need to get into this mode of how do we get into a much more collaborative way to plan and do it in a much more. So one piece of advice I would give is, like, honestly, test yourself out. Like, look at your last sales planning process and look at how long that took. Just don't try and be too critical of yourself and say, how do I improve that? And you'll basically find that if you're not going to get the budget to move into a SaaS world or all this stuff, that's fine. But then you need to figure out, then you'll focus on the methods. And once you do the methods, and then once like the CFO and like the VP of sales, these like walk in, they'll be like, wow, all these people are here on a weekend. What is going on? Right?
And the other thing that you notice is like growing companies, right? Because the pressures on growth now is a lot more. So it's not like you were doing planning once a year. You're almost planning every 3 months for the next 18 months kind of thing.
Okay, so let me paint if you want the business case for kind of going to, I'll paint you the business case right now, okay? And that is as follows. The ability to be able to build a product, to put it to market and distribute and then compete with each of your industries is next to zero right now. Every single one of your companies, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, okay? What does that basically mean? It basically means is that fundamentally your sales motion and your go-to-market motion has to be agile and has to be reactive to what's happening in the market. And your market cycle changes are not going over a year, they're going over much smaller times. So if that therefore means that you've got to be able to react to market changes in such a way that you cannot wait another 6-7 months to be able to do it, right? And you need to have data sources to do it, and you're like, how did we lose this deal to this person? Like, like, how did this happen, right? Once you start having those conversations and doing the postmortems, you're like, okay. So therefore, the planning piece is so critical that you need to have platforms that allow you to be able to basically make those shifts, to ingest the level of data, and to be able to help you make decisions. Yeah. The best systems are the ones that help you make decisions, not relay back to you like how awful you are. Like that's like, I do that every day. Like I have a mirror, like look at my wardrobe, look at this. It is. Exactly. I'm an ICIO. I get that feedback every day. It's totally fine, right? Yeah. So what I'm saying is like, if the planning cycle, and we have to get into this mindset that we are in a much more competitive business environment than we've ever been before. How are you going to compete?
Yeah. No, that's a super important point. I think, we're going away from annual planning cycles to always on planning, right? We always have to be agile and plan against it. So planning, we know in sales ops all the issues that we have on planning, but from your perspective, right, what are the biggest stumbling blocks that come into companies' way when they get into the planning cycles?
So let's go back to things that cause issues with planning, and that's exceptions, which is that you're not planning for exceptions, right? And that happens in every sales cycle. It's every comp planning nightmare. It's every commissions analyst nightmare. It's like all of these. So one is like, it's a small tactical thing, but like think about all the exceptions that you've had and all of those data points. Yeah.
So that's who yells loudest.
Exactly. It's the entertainment value from the CIO suite, fantastic. Honest to God, like seriously, I'm just like, wow, like this is actually happening. Like, did you see that interaction? That's great, amazing. Exactly. He said that with a straight face, right? So, so what was the question again? I'm sorry, I'm like going through
issues coming in from your view.
Issue planning, yeah. So one is that. The second is agreeing on data sources and at least doing some degree of incremental planning in using an incrementally, or at least cleaning incrementally to know that you're doing a much better planning cycle. Like most people don't do enough retrospective, and so being able to do that from a data set standpoint is really key. I think the biggest thing is honestly the planning for planning. Like most people, it's actually a change management exercise. You actually have to get people in a place which say, by the way, oh, looks like you are taking vacation when we're all agreeing these plans and going to market and trying to basically become a profitable company and not, So there's like a logistics piece to it, but there's a bigger piece which is just about enablement around getting people, around, and it's kind of a campaign that you need to basically run to be able to do it, right? I think the last piece is it's actually a good opportunity to take a viewpoint and be pretty ambitious, right? And that basically means that if you go for big and related goals from one perspective, it allows you to basically say, okay, even if that's 2 years from now, actually, if it's like really audacious, being able to say how you get to that, that's a really healthy exercise. You're like, okay, the math doesn't work.
I need to go
back. We need more productivity from these reps in this territory, this TAM. That's not basically working. It actually is a much better. So taking a longer viewpoint towards it is I believe.
So it goes back to the partnership discussion having with IT. Like, okay, we're going to have a plan. What's a 2-year plan?
Totally.
And working backwards from there. So that's something actually, all of us, in Salesforce, would fail at that because all sales ops is normally reacting.
Yeah.
And we always go to the IT guys as the execution arm, right? Not an equal partner in making the decision. So
I really appreciate the compliment. Thank you very much. Other people have not said that about me all my career, but okay, fair enough.
No, but I think that's something that we all have a responsibility to fix.
Yeah.
So from an IT perspective, right? We've all seen the movie of DevOps.
Yes.
And then how the chefs and the puppets of the world have come and really
helps,
right? At least done something and give us a microservices architecture for DevOps.
Yes.
Do you think the same thing would apply in the sales ops world?
I think it's going to take some time to do that.
Okay.
I think people are waking up to the fact about having much more agility. I think people are waking up to the fact that there is much more software that can go to solve a lot of these problems. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that there is much more compute power and there's much more imagination about solving some of these problems, I think that allows it. So I do think that people are somewhere along that journey. I think it's a longer journey to basically have because I think it's going to be vastly different today than it is going to be a couple of years from now, right? but in short, I do believe that. I do believe that there's a change of thinking on that.
If that's going to happen,
Yes.
and sales ops will have a lot more automation, much like a DevOps.
Yes.
And we'll have at least from that's our bet as well as Fullcast. That's what we think building the policy infrastructure. In sales ops, like we said earlier, started off as a shadow IT.
Yeah.
Right. And so a lot of the ops people still prefer, right, to go into CRM and actually code and do something.
God bless
How do you see that their careers evolving with all these changes coming forward?
Sales ops and coding on Apex scripts. Okay. No, I mean, no. I'm just, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good one. The way I look at most functions, sales ops included, from a vision and objective standpoint, is where are you able to add most strategic value? Number one. Number two, are you able to increase that value over a period of time? So if you have an operational function across the board, irrespective, IT, finance, facilities, the question really comes down to is, what are you doing over a course of year 1, year 2, year 3, that basically adds, and I do think that career is part of it, and I think that's a larger goal that people should be aiming towards versus, I think, specific aspects of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because what I've seen is a lot of sales ops people, right? They pride themselves, not because, I think it's because sales ops is a discipline, right?
Yeah.
Still has not had it's a very tools-driven issue.
A lot of tools.
And depending on whether you're an SFDC admin to sales strategy to sales, everything gets lumped into one umbrella bucket called sales operations.
Yeah.
Right. So that's an area I think where we think IT can help in helping us at least get out of the mirror of data.
I think one thing is I think the biggest issue is that if you align sales ops with IT using the kind of quarterly cadence, I think that's actually a good starting point to be able to get people aligned. Okay. So figuring out when you make changes or deploying out changes through specific aspects of your CRM or different tool sets or integrations, and doing that as a quarterly goal, like that's actually a good way to be able to get people aligned, number one. Number two, that basically then helps to be able to help prioritize and say where things basically land. So for example, if you are looking to make massive changes within CRM or specific tools within that, what is the right timing to do it? Number one, it's not just about that. It's just like, okay, where will this have most impact that we can basically measure, right? Or I think the other piece is that there hasn't been enough conversation about the level of work that's, I mean, there are so many companies, they will come up to you and say, oh, just plug it in and it just works. A lot of those, with respect to everyone who's basically bought those. And that's absolutely, and they probably do, right? But getting the value out of it, that's not that conversation. Yeah. Because a lot of people can switch stuff off. So I think the vendors will go around, and that's why I really enjoyed talking with you about a year and plus ago, because there was a lot of intellectual input that's gone in terms of how you and Bala and the team have kind of thought about the product. And that related to me as CIO. And it probably would to a whole bunch of other CIOs.
So, thank you.
No problem.
So as we think about the cycle,
yes.
right, of the planning, go-to-market planning cycle, we are now all moving towards this account-based in everything approach,
yes.
engagement approach, right?
Definitely.
Every company aspires to do that.
That is a movement, and it's very real.
Right,
so, yes.
and especially if you're in the SaaS business now, you only get the right to earn revenue when you close the deal. You still have to manage it all the way.
Yeah.
Do you see that like, ops now has a lot more stakeholders, from finance to marketing to customer success, for the same data on CRM? So should CRM be part of IT, or should it still sit within core sales?
I think governance of CRM, and I say this on behalf of my CIO brothers and sisters, I do think that there is a governance aspect of CRM that sits within IT. I think there's an aspect of being able to control and having structure from a technical stability and data structuring standpoint, that I do think that those CIO and those IT organizations which have a vested interest and are connected with the company to do it, I think they're the right partners to do it.
Okay.
If they are not aligned to that, that's okay. because they've got a whole bunch of other priorities. Like, trust me, like a lot of CIOs join a lot of big companies, and you think, oh, what's the first thing they're going to do? And they figure out basics and foundational stuff, which is infrastructure related, got nothing to do with sales ops. Okay, so I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that the CRM as a core operating platform within a company has to be owned just like other core operating platforms do. They need to be governed, and the governance process needs to basically be very transparent. And it is not like, oh, we don't have time for it. It needs to be measured in such a way that says, hey, both for auditability, for compliance, which are not great reasons to do something, but they are reasons, and people are going to be forced into this. But for agility and for kind of just stability, and and just kind of having a good centerpiece as a referee kind of thing from a governance standpoint, I think there's something to be said about that.
So CRM right now is a key enterprise database. It's no longer just something that sits under a sales guy's desk and say, I own my CRM, I have my license, and I'm going to.
Still a lot of access databases out there.
Yes, out there.
Just want to, you know, they literally are sitting underneath people's desks.
But
I've seen them. It's real, basically.
Yeah. So to that point then, going back to driving alignment,
yes.
right? You're coming back full circle on this one is because if CRM is a core enterprise data, which requires governance, unfortunately today people buy Salesforce and they said, oh, anybody can start doing accounts. And because that's how every company starts.
An entire industry which is built on cleaning up Salesforce. Seriously, it's an entire ecosystem. Like people are like, oh wow, we come up and clean up your mess. They just don't say that. It's called an SOW, but that's what they say. Right.
So we agree that it requires governance.
Yeah.
It requires IT support.
Yeah.
Yet in the real world, IT generally has a Scrum team. At least that's what we said. We would have Scrum team on the IT side, and we would tell them we need blah. And they'll put it on the list, and the prioritization would be, I'm doing these projects that are break fix, and then this is what you need. I'm going to put it right at the bottom of the thing. It takes me 3 months to get something done. So, how do you make the IT side also see the strategic side that you're managing an enterprise database that needs to be flexible with a changing go-to-market that we talked about?
Very simple. You find out what the common denominator is, and then you make it work. So most people forget about this. They say, we're going to propose a piece of functionality and an improvement to a change. And they make this terrible assumption that the CIO, the IT organization, doesn't get what the actual objective of what the goal was. You bring it down to the fact that this is going to directly impact sales velocity, which impacts more revenue. And people don't tell that story. People look at it as changes in software, and that's a terrible way to do it. If you want to build up alignment with the IT organization, I will advocate for every CIO who wants to be involved, and they are, if you look at every CIO survey, you'll basically see that there's a much bigger drive to be able to aid go-to-market. You need to be able to, it is the job of the sales ops function, I'll say this, I love you all, but you need to basically be able to come to the table and say, here are the priorities and here's where, and you have to remember, when we, and I say, IT organizations say no to something, there's a reason. I know maybe we're not very good at articulating it sometimes. I sort of get that.
It's
right?
It's a
but
shared
there's a whole bunch of stuff that there will always be more stuff for everyone to do. There always, so find out the common denominator that drives it. Right? Yeah. And in some companies, it's going to be about revenue, and some companies it's going to be about cost efficiency, and others it's going to be about operational excellence, and others it's going to be, we have a new CEO, we have a new president of sales, we have and so get the common denominator and then use that as a way to be able to do it. That's really important. It very rarely happens, right? And then it's like, oh, it's a change request. Oh, it didn't happen. They'll say, no, we need to go show. And it doesn't make sense, basically.
So if you're a growing company, right, you don't have a CI, a full-time IT team, right? You don't have all the staff. But you still, sales ops practitioners need to start thinking about data governance way ahead of time.
Companies are moving to, so let me stop there for a second, and I'll tell you why. Is because growing companies or otherwise, one thing you've got to realize is over-customization of your systems. Don't customize and put in customization for reporting purposes. That is circa 2003. Seriously, building up all of these custom tables because somebody said, I would like a really good report. Don't do that. Because there's a whole, the way you do that is through APIs and data structuring, and there's lots of platforms which have much more intelligence and much more compute power to be able to do it. So the moment you start basically putting in more validation rules and more custom fields and more subcategories, that looks great, but that's like, don't do it for reporting purposes. That's one. Number two, this over-customization thing, like you have to get into a mode which says, why are we doing something? It's not because somebody said, I didn't see it, we need to build a report. That cannot be the reason for doing something. Because every time you add in more stuff into your system, it gets heavier. It's just how it is, basically, right? And so there's another integration that you need to support. When you go into a new user interface for that system, whether it's a CRM or others, and you do changes to your site, that's one more thing that you need to test out. Like, it doesn't work in the longer term. So for people who don't have IT organizations or which are entrenched within sales ops, so get that. What my biggest advice is, as you grow, be very diligent and think about the type of system that you want to have in 3 years' time. Like, just think of it from that standpoint. Like, so when I basically was building up, I was working at a number of companies where they were growing rapidly. The question that some of my teams used to come up to me, they're like, okay, we've done this thing, we're going to deploy this out. I said, okay, that looks good. Will it work for 5 people who start here tomorrow on day 1? They'll be like, yeah, totally, that's how we thought about it. I said, okay, does it work for the 20 people who start in Asia, and another 10 people who start in Europe, and then another 7 people who start remotely? Will that process work? No. Okay, let's go think that again. So build for scale now, right? Because if we're in this industry, we're not thinking, I mean, these are the team, and I'll shout out, like, you're like getting things done. You're helping build the business. Yes. So you're not doing it because you're like, oh, as long as I can increase it by a little bit, that's not your objective. So why would you think so short term?
Think long.
So think about what this looks like 3 years from now, and build a foundation for that, basically. Build scalable processes, build scalable systems to do that.
I know we're over time, but one last question for Yousuf on this one. I asked this question earlier to the panel as well. A lot of times people get frustrated with the Salesforce implementation.
No, never heard that. A shocker.
And then they're like,
seriously?
Should we start all over again? Should we nuke this, or should we start all over again? As a CIO, what do you think about that?
I really like Salesforce. I can be honest. I'm a big fan, like a huge fan. I just think they've built an entire platform for people to thrive and build companies around. They've built a developer ecosystem. I'm a big fan. I think don't apply it from like how I've implemented Salesforce. Think about it as just, there's a small part which says, what were you thinking? Like, no one actually has that question. Like, what were you thinking? Yeah? So like, when you go, so people are frustrated by complexity, but they seem to forget that, it served a purpose at a certain time. Yeah. The thing that I believe that sales ops functions have not done well, and I would like to encourage you to do so, is to try and take time to be able to, before systems like Salesforce others go out of control, take retrospective. And so like when you do your offsites or your QBRs or whatever it is, basically, like try and get think time to be able to say, okay, we need to clean up a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah. There will always be things to clean up. Yes, it will be about data. It's a big problem. Go right ahead. Happy to take a conversation. I'll grab a coffee with you any day of the week to be able to give you that playbook. But I do encourage you to not just speak with Salesforce partners. I do encourage you to speak to your peers. I encourage you to speak to CIOs and see what the problems that exist. But I do encourage you to think about and look at this and put yourselves in the shoes. I mean, I have a tremendous amount of empathy for sales ops organizations and go-to-market organizations, AEs, and people who are out there in the field. Think of it this way. Think about think about a rep that has just been on board in your company, and they don't have an office. They are remote. They have to build a territory from scratch. They have to go through a town. How would they operate? They're 3 hours ahead, sometimes 6 hours ahead. How would they be productive? Yeah. And when they're not, I'm sorry, but you're part of that picture.
Exactly. You own the responsibility.
Right? So if you build for that, I fundamentally, and then there's just the sales enablement function is a big part of this, and building up that partnership. So successful companies internally build successful partnerships, sales ops specifically, because they're at the heart of it. Yeah. Right? That's why I have a tremendous amount of time and energy and focus towards sales ops, because I just think that they're so fundamental to people drive and navigate the success of companies in a way that the other functions are not. Yeah. Right? So,
thank you, Yousuf. we could have gone on and on, but this is really useful.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.